Fort Bragg, 1970, a quiet suburban neighborhood within the bustling military base. Among the rows of identical homes with their neatly trimmed lawns stood the house of the McDonald family, a picture of stability and success. Jeffrey MacDonald, a handsome and charismatic Army Green Beret, was well respected by his peers. His wife Colette was devoted to their two young daughters, Kimberly and Kristen. To the outside world, their lives seemed idyllic, a shining example of the American dream. But perfection is often a facade. Colette was a kind-hearted woman, juggling motherhood while pursuing her dream of becoming a teacher. Kimberly, just 5 years old, was an inquisitive and bright child who adored her parents. Kristen, the baby of the family, was a bundle of energy and laughter, filling the house with joy. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Neighbors occasionally heard muffled arguments through the walls, though nothing loud enough to raise alarms. Colette's closest friends had noticed her growing frustration. "Jeffrey's always at the hospital," she confided once, her voice tinged with sadness. "Sometimes I feel like a single parent." Jeffrey's demanding career at the base hospital left him little time for his family. He was often called a perfectionist by his colleagues, driven to excel in everything he did. But at home, his absences began to weigh on Colette. She struggled with the loneliness of raising two children with minimal support, and the creeping suspicion that their once passionate marriage was now just a partnership of convenience. Despite these strains, Colette still held out hope. She planned to finish her teaching degree, believing it might reignite a sense of purpose for herself. But as weeks turned into months, their arguments became more frequent, often about mundane things, groceries, bills, or Jeffrey's long hours. "Why can't you be here when we need you?" she snapped one evening. Jeffrey, exasperated, muttered under his breath, "I provide for this family, isn't that enough?" Still, they kept up appearances. Family friends admired how Colette hosted dinner parties with ease, always wearing a warm smile. Jeffrey's colleagues praised his dedication. To everyone around them, the McDonald seemed untouchable, even enviable. But envy often blinds people to the truth. In early February, Colette confided to her best friend Mary over coffee. "He's been so distant," she said softly, staring into her cup. "I don't know if I'm imagining it, but sometimes it feels like we're not on the same side anymore." Mary reassured her, but the conversation lingered in her mind. Colette had never spoken so openly about her unhappiness before. As the days passed, a strange tension seemed to hang in the air at the McDonald home. Colette's attempts to bridge the growing emotional gap with Jeffrey were met with indifference. He seemed preoccupied, even distracted, as if carrying a weight he couldn't or wouldn't share. One night, Kimberly, sensing her parents' distance, clutched Colette's hand and whispered, "Mommy, are you and Daddy okay?" Colette forced a smile, brushing her daughter's golden hair aside. "Of course, sweetheart, Daddy's just tired. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. The small moments of tension began to escalate. On Valentine's Day, Colette found a receipt for a restaurant she hadn't visited with Jeffrey. She didn't bring it up immediately, but tucked it away, her mind racing with possibilities. That same evening, neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the McDonald house. It lasted only a few minutes before silence fell once more. Jeffrey continued to present a calm and collected demeanor at work, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He was more withdrawn during conversations, often lost in thought. A fellow doctor asked him over lunch one day, "You doing okay, Jeff? You seem distracted." Jeffrey laughed it off, saying, "Just the usual. Busy at home, busy here. You know how it is." But his forced chuckle and the distant look in his eyes told another story. 2 days before the tragedy, Colette visited her parents with the girls. Freddy Cassab, her stepfather, recalled her seeming unusually quiet. She wasn't herself, he later recounted. Something was bothering her, but she wouldn't say what. Colette's mother, Mildred, pressed her gently, but Colette simply shook her head, brushing it off with a weak smile. As the sun set on February 16, 1970, the McDonald house appeared peaceful from the outside. The living room light glowed faintly through the curtains, casting warm shadows on the front porch. Inside, Kimberly and Kristen had already been tucked into bed. Jeffrey sat on the couch, flipping through a medical journal while Colette tidied the kitchen. There was an almost eerie calm about the evening, a deceptive normalcy that would soon shatter in unimaginable ways. At around 10 p.m., Colette finally sat down beside Jeffrey, attempting once more to reach out. "We can't keep going like this," she began, her voice quiet but firm. Jeffrey didn't look up. "Colette, not now," he replied. the tension in his tone unmistakable. Colette stood abruptly, her frustration boiling over. "Not now? When, Jeff? When will it ever be now?" she snapped before storming off to the bedroom. Jeffrey remained on the couch, rubbing his temples, the weight of their strained relationship bearing down on him. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the neighborhood sank into silence. No one could have known that, in just a few hours, this family's perfect facade would be obliterated, and nothing would ever be the same again. The soft glow of the living room lamp cast long shadows across the walls of the McDonald home as the clock ticked past midnight on February 17, 1970. Outside, the quiet neighborhood of Fort Bragg lay still, blanketed by the cold night air. Inside, the peace was deceptive, fragile, fleeting, about to shatter into chaos. Jeffrey MacDonald had fallen asleep on the living room couch, still dressed in his blue pajama top. The medical journal he had been reading lay discarded on the floor, pages bent as if abandoned in haste. In the bedrooms, Kimberly and Kristen were nestled under their blankets, their breathing soft and steady. Colette was in the master bedroom, alone, her thoughts heavy with the unresolved tension from earlier that evening. At 3:42 a.m., a frantic phone call pierced the silence at the military police station. "Help! They've been stabbed! My wife and kids!" The voice on the line was trembling, breathless, almost incoherent. It was Jeffrey MacDonald. The line went dead before the operator could ask for more details. Within minutes, military police vehicles sped down the quiet streets, their sirens cutting through the stillness of the night. When officers arrived at 544 Castle Drive, what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, save for the faint, strained voice of Jeffrey MacDonald calling for help. I tried to save them," he murmured as officers found him lying on the floor of the living room, clutching his side. Blood smeared his hands and soaked his pajama top, though his injuries appeared superficial: a cut on his forehead, a stab wound in his abdomen, and bruises on his arms. But it was the scene beyond the living room that would haunt the officers forever. In the master bedroom, Colette lay sprawled across the floor, her head near the edge of the bed. She had been bludgeoned repeatedly with what appeared to be a heavy object, her arms broken as if in a desperate attempt to shield herself. Stab wounds covered her torso, deep and relentless. Above her headboard, the word pig was scrawled in blood, crude and horrifying. In the next room, 5-year-old Kimberly was found tucked into her bed, her small frame barely visible beneath the blood-soaked sheets. Her injuries mirrored her mother's, violent and merciless. Officers struggled to comprehend how anyone could unleash such brutality on a child. Across the hallway in the nursery, little Kristen lay on her side, clutching a teddy bear. She had been stabbed over 30 times, the wounds so deep they penetrated to the bone. The brutality of the scene overwhelmed even the most seasoned investigators. The walls told a grim story. Splatters of blood marked a violent struggle, moving from room to room. Yet something about the scene didn't sit right. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The furniture remained mostly undisturbed, as if the violence had been contained to its victims and their attacker. When questioned, Jeffrey's account was as chilling as the scene itself. He described waking up to the screams of Colette and Kimberly. Before he could react, he claimed, he was attacked by a group of 4 intruders, a blonde woman in a floppy hat holding a candle, and 3 men, 1 black and 2 white. They had burst into the home chanting eerie phrases like, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." Jeffrey said he had fought valiantly, using a piece of wood to fend them off before being knocked unconscious. When he awoke, he said, he found his family slaughtered and called for help. His story, while dramatic, immediately raised questions. Why had the intruders left him alive? How had they overpowered a trained Green Beret so easily? And why were there no signs of a forced break-in? As the morning light crept into the house, these questions weighed heavily on the minds of the investigators. Outside the house, the first rays of dawn began to streak across the sky. Neighbors had gathered, their faces pale with disbelief as news of the murder spread. "It doesn't make sense," one neighbor whispered to another. "They were such a normal family. Who could do something like this?" Back inside, forensic technicians began their work, carefully cataloging every detail of the grisly scene. A knife, an ice pick, and a piece of wood, later identified as the murder weapons, were found just outside the back door. Blood spatter analysis would soon reveal patterns that contradicted Jeffrey's account, but in those first hours, suspicion had yet to solidify. Jeffrey was rushed to the hospital for treatment while Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen were taken to the morgue, leaving behind only the deafening silence of an empty, blood-soaked home. As the house at 544 Castle Drive stood in stillness, the questions grew louder. What had truly happened in the dead of night? And why did the scene feel so wrong? The McDonald family tragedy was no longer just a case of brutal violence. It was becoming a web of contradictions and unanswered questions. In the days following the murders, the military police, CID, worked tirelessly. But the deeper they delved, the more unsettling the inconsistencies in Jeffrey MacDonald's story became. What initially seemed like a horrifying invasion began to unravel into something far more sinister. The first sign that something was amiss lay in the physical evidence. The house, though the site of a savage massacre, showed no signs of forced entry. Every door and window remained intact, each lock unbroken. It seemed improbable that 4 attackers, as described by Jeffrey, could enter and leave without disturbing even the simplest barrier. Investigators also noted the eerie stillness of the furniture. Chairs, tables, and other items were undisturbed, as if the violence had erupted selectively on the victims, leaving the surroundings untouched. Then there were Jeffrey's injuries. While Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen suffered devastating blows and dozens of stab wounds, Jeffrey's wounds appeared relatively minor. A small puncture wound to his lung, a cut on his forehead, and minor bruising on his arms were hardly consistent with the life-or-death struggle he described. One investigator, shaking his head, muttered under his breath, "He fought off 4 people. Doesn't look like he fought off a fly." Jeffrey's pajama top quickly became a focal point in the investigation. According to his testimony, the shirt was ripped apart during the initial struggle with the intruders, its fragments scattered throughout the house. But forensic experts made a chilling discovery. Fibers from the pajama top were found beneath Colette's body, suggesting that the shirt had been torn, not in the living room, as Jeffrey claimed, but in the master bedroom, after Colette had already fallen victim to the attack. Even more damning, tiny fibers from the shirt were found in the bedrooms of both Kimberly and Kristen, raising an unspoken question. Had Jeffrey been in those rooms during the murders? As suspicions deepened, CID investigators turned their attention to the murder weapons. The knife, ice pick, and club had all been wiped clean of fingerprints, yet all 3 were confirmed to have come from within the McDonald home. This contradicted Jeffrey's assertion that the weapons were brought in by the intruders. The scene painted a chilling picture. Whoever committed these murders not only used items readily available in the home, but also had the time and presence of mind to methodically clean and discard them just outside the back door. Adding to the growing list of irregularities was the blood evidence. Forensic analysis revealed that each family member had a distinct blood type, a rare occurrence that allowed investigators to map out the movements of both the victims and the perpetrator. Colette's blood type A was concentrated in the master bedroom, while Kimberly's blood type AB was found in 2 locations, the master bedroom and her own room. This suggested she had been attacked in the bedroom she shared with her parents and then moved. Kristen's blood type B was confined to her nursery, painting a haunting image of isolation and targeted violence. Jeffrey's blood type O was found sparingly, with no trace of it in the children's rooms, further undermining his claim of a chaotic fight with multiple attackers. Amid the mounting evidence, a name surfaced that seemed to align with Jeffrey's description of the intruders: Helena Stockley. A 22-year-old known for her drug use and erratic behavior, Helena was infamous in Fayetteville for her connection to the local counterculture. She matched Jeffrey's depiction of the floppy-hatted woman who chanted, "Acid is groovy." When brought in for questioning, Helena made a startling statement. She confessed to being at the McDonald home the night of the murders. "I was there," she said, her voice shaky, "but I don't remember much. I was high, so high." For a brief moment, her confession seemed to validate Jeffrey's story. But as investigators probed deeper, Helena's account began to crumble. She couldn't recall specific details of the house or the crime scene. When asked about the positions of the bodies or the weapons, she faltered, her answers vague and inconsistent. Some suspected that Helena's admission was an attempt to seek attention, a tragic byproduct of her drug-addled mind. Others believed she might have genuinely been involved, but was too intoxicated to remember the truth. Still, Helena's emergence injected an element of doubt into the case. Was she an unreliable witness, or the missing link to the truth? Investigators pressed her associates for more information, only to uncover conflicting testimonies. One acquaintance claimed Helena had confessed to the murders in vivid detail, while another insisted she was with them the entire night, far from the McDonald home. The growing web of contradictions weighed heavily on Freddy Cassab, Colette's stepfather. Once a vocal supporter of Jeffrey's innocence, Freddy began to feel the gnawing pull of doubt. He pored over the emerging evidence, each revelation further shaking his belief in the man he once called the perfect husband. As he sat in the quiet of his home one night, surrounded by photos of Colette and the grandchildren he'd lost, Freddy whispered to himself, "If he's lying, God help me, I'll find out." Freddy Cassab sat in his modest living room, a cup of cold coffee untouched on the table before him. The photograph of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen stared back at him from its frame on the mantelpiece, their smiles frozen in time, hauntingly vibrant. Freddy had always considered himself a good judge of character. When Colette introduced him to Jeffrey years earlier, he had welcomed the young Green Beret into the family with open arms, convinced that Colette had found her perfect match. But now, that conviction was eroding, replaced by something darker, doubt. The phone calls from Jeffrey in the weeks following the murders had initially been a source of comfort. Jeffrey spoke often of his grief, his frustrations with the investigation, and the unbearable pain of losing his family. But as the days turned into weeks, Freddy began to notice peculiarities in Jeffrey's tone. His words seemed rehearsed, his emotions oddly detached. One evening, as Freddy replayed their latest conversation in his mind, he froze at something Jeffrey had said. "They're trying to pin this on me, Freddy. Can you believe that? After everything I've been through." The words rang hollow, almost defensive, as if Jeffrey was more concerned with clearing his name than mourning his wife and daughters. Freddy's growing unease led him to revisit every detail of the case, starting with Jeffrey's description of the crime. He had heard the story many times now. Jeffrey waking to screams, fighting off intruders, losing consciousness, and awakening to a house drenched in blood. But the pieces didn't fit. How could a man trained in combat, a decorated soldier, sustain only minor injuries while his entire family was brutally slaughtered? And why were the murder weapons, all from within the house, wiped clean of fingerprints? The more Freddy thought about it, the more the scenario Jeffrey painted seemed implausible. Determined to find answers, Freddy requested copies of the investigative reports and forensic findings. He pored over them late into the night, his hands trembling as he read about the blood patterns, the pajama fibers, and the incongruities between Jeffrey's testimony and the physical evidence. Colette's blood was found on Jeffrey's pajama top, fibers of which were discovered under her body. Kimberly's blood was in the master bedroom, suggesting she had been attacked there first before being moved. Freddy's breath caught as he read these details, the implications gnawing at his resolve. Freddy's doubts reached a boiling point when he watched Jeffrey's television interview. Seated confidently in front of the cameras, Jeffrey spoke not of his family, but of the injustice he believed he was facing. "The army is covering up their own incompetence," he said, his tone clipped and defensive. "This is a witch hunt." Freddy watched in stunned silence as Jeffrey smiled slightly, as if the interview was an opportunity rather than a plea for justice. Colette's stepfather clenched his fist, his mind racing. Was this grief or something else entirely? Unable to contain his suspicions any longer, Freddy visited the military police investigator handling the case. He shared his concerns, his voice trembling as he relayed every inconsistency, every unsettling detail. "I trusted him," Freddy said, his voice cracking. "I believed him, but something's not right. It just doesn't add up." The investigator listened intently, nodding as Freddy recounted the timeline of events Jeffrey had described and how they conflicted with the physical evidence. Freddy's transformation from Jeffrey's staunchest supporter to his most determined adversary was as painful as it was necessary. He had adored Jeffrey, considered him family, but now, staring at the facts, Freddy felt betrayed, not just for himself, but for Colette and the girls. He began documenting everything: timelines, statements, and forensic inconsistencies. "If he's lying," Freddy whispered to himself one sleepless night, "I'll make sure the truth comes out, no matter what." The final crack in Freddy's faith came when he visited the graveyard. Standing over Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen's shared grave, he felt an overwhelming wave of anger. "I failed you," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. But in that moment, his grief hardened into resolve. Freddy Cassab would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, even if it meant destroying the man he once called a son. In the months following the murders, Jeffrey MacDonald seemed to embody resilience. To the public, he was a tragic figure, a decorated Green Beret, a respected doctor, and a man who had endured the unthinkable. His appearances on television painted a picture of a grieving husband and father fighting against injustice. Yet, in private, those closest to him began to see cracks in the carefully constructed facade. Jeffrey's first television interview aired just weeks after the tragedy. Sitting in a neatly pressed suit, his demeanor was calm, composed, even confident. He recounted the night of the murders in vivid detail, emphasizing the terror of being attacked by a group of drug-crazed intruders. "I fought as hard as I could," he said, his voice steady, "but I was outnumbered. They overwhelmed me." His words were chilling, but his tone lacked the raw emotion one might expect from a man who had lost his entire family. Critics noted that he spoke more about clearing his name than about Colette, Kimberly, or Kristen. For the public, the interview was polarizing. Some saw a grieving man unfairly targeted by investigators. Others couldn't shake the feeling that something about his story didn't add up. Among the skeptics was Freddy Cassab. Watching the interview from his living room, Freddy couldn't ignore the nagging unease in his gut. "Where's the grief?" he murmured. "Where's the pain?" As Jeffrey continued to appear on talk shows and in newspaper articles, his tone became more defiant. He accused the military police of mishandling the investigation, suggesting that their incompetence had allowed the real killers to escape. "This is a cover-up," he claimed in one interview, his voice rising with frustration. "They're trying to pin this on me because they don't have anyone else." For some, his assertiveness was compelling, a man fighting for justice. But for others, including Freddy, it felt rehearsed, almost calculated. Privately, Jeffrey's behavior raised even more questions. Colleagues at the hospital described him as unusually upbeat, even jovial, in the weeks after the murders. One co-worker recalled him joking about dating again, a remark that left those present stunned. "It didn't seem like something a grieving husband would say," the co-worker later admitted. "It felt off." Friends who visited Jeffrey's home after the murders noticed an almost eerie normalcy. The house was tidy, devoid of any signs of mourning. Gone were the photographs of Colette and the girls that had once adorned the walls. "It was like they'd been erased," one visitor remarked, "as if they'd never existed." The contradictions between Jeffrey's public persona and his private life became more glaring as time went on. While he spoke passionately in interviews about seeking justice, his actions told a different story. He showed little interest in cooperating with investigators, often dodging follow-up questions about the details of his account. When asked to take a lie detector test, he refused, citing advice from his lawyer. "I don't trust those things," he said dismissively. To his detractors, the refusal was damning. To his supporters, it was merely a precaution. But perhaps the most troubling revelation came from a neighbor who claimed to have seen Jeffrey on the night of the murders. According to the neighbor, Jeffrey was spotted outside his house, walking calmly to the mailbox sometime after midnight. The neighbor hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming Jeffrey was retrieving a letter or taking a late-night stroll. But in hindsight, the sighting raised a troubling question. What was Jeffrey doing outside when, by his own account, he should have been fighting for his life? The mounting inconsistencies in Jeffrey's behavior and testimony began to take their toll on public opinion. While some continued to rally behind him, others started to view him with suspicion. Freddy, now fully convinced that Jeffrey was hiding something, began documenting every discrepancy he could find. He kept meticulous notes, writing down dates, times, and statements that didn't align with the evidence. For Freddy, the turning point came during a casual conversation with one of Jeffrey's friends. The friend mentioned that Jeffrey had planned a weekend ski trip just days after the murders, as if nothing had happened. Freddy's hands trembled as he processed the information. "A ski trip?" he repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. "How does a man bury his family one day and go skiing the next?" The more Freddy learned, the clearer the picture became. The Jeffrey MacDonald he had trusted, the man he had once considered a son, was not the same man standing before the cameras. Behind the polished interviews and defiant sound bites lay a person whose actions betrayed his words, a person who seemed more concerned with salvaging his reputation than mourning his loss. Freddy sat alone in his study, surrounded by stacks of notes and newspaper clippings. As he stared at a photo of Colette and the girls, a single thought consumed him. The truth is out there, and I won't stop until I find it. The name Helena Stockley first surfaced in whispers, an unsteady lead, almost too surreal to be taken seriously. A 22-year-old Fayetteville local, Helena was known for her erratic behavior, heavy drug use, and penchant for wandering the streets wearing flamboyant outfits, including a distinctive floppy hat. The details of Jeffrey MacDonald's story, a woman with blonde hair chanting eerie phrases about acid and pigs, were eerily reminiscent of Helena's appearance and reputation. But could she have truly been involved in the massacre at 544 Castle Drive? The CID's interest in Helena peaked when she reportedly told acquaintances that she had been at the McDonald home the night of the murders. "I was there," she allegedly confessed, her voice hushed and trembling. Her claims were chilling. She described holding a candle while 3 men carried out the killings. Yet, when pressed for details, her story became fragmented. She couldn't recall specifics about the layout of the house, the positioning of the bodies, or the sequence of events. It was clear she had been under the influence of drugs during the alleged confession, making her reliability questionable. Still, her statements couldn't be ignored. Investigators brought Helena in for questioning. She arrived looking disheveled, her eyes darting nervously as she answered their questions with halting, inconsistent responses. "I remember a lot of screaming," she muttered at one point. When asked for more, she hesitated, wringing her hands. "It's all blurry. I was high, really high." Helena's story seemed to unravel as quickly as it had emerged. For every detail that aligned with the crime, there were glaring gaps and contradictions. Some investigators dismissed her entirely, chalking up her claims to drug-induced delusions. Others weren't so sure. Her initial confession included eerie similarities to the crime scene, details that hadn't been made public. How could she have known? As Helena's involvement became a point of contention, Jeffrey's defense seized on her as a potential scapegoat. His lawyers argued that she and her associates matched the description of the alleged intruders. "This is the woman my client saw," his attorney proclaimed during a media interview, holding up a photograph of Helena in her floppy hat. For supporters of Jeffrey's innocence, Helena became a symbol of the investigation's failure, a lead ignored in the rush to convict him. But as her notoriety grew, Helena's behavior became more erratic. She alternated between insisting she was involved and vehemently denying it. Friends of Helena provided conflicting accounts. One claimed she had openly admitted her role, while another swore she was with them at a party miles away on the night of the murders. The lack of concrete evidence against her left investigators frustrated. Without physical proof, her story was little more than a haunting possibility. While Helena's role hung in limbo, forensic evidence continued to mount against Jeffrey. A pivotal breakthrough came with the discovery of his pajama top. In court, prosecutors demonstrated how the garment, riddled with holes, matched the stab wounds on Colette's chest. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence, suggesting the shirt had been placed over Colette's body and stabbed deliberately. A revelation that directly contradicted Jeffrey's account of it being torn in the living room struggle. Another damning piece of evidence involved blood spatter analysis. Experts testified that the distribution of bloodstains in the house told a story, one that clashed with Jeffrey's version of events. Kimberly's blood was found in the master bedroom in the hallway, indicating she had been attacked there before being moved to her bed. Kristen's blood was confined to her room, suggesting she was the last victim. Jeffrey's own blood, in stark contrast, was found only in the living room, where his superficial injuries occurred. The pattern painted a chilling picture of controlled violence, not chaotic intrusion. As the case unfolded, Freddy Cassab continued his relentless pursuit of the truth. Helena's confessions had initially given him pause, but the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence kept him focused on Jeffrey. "She's a distraction," Freddy told investigators. "Don't lose sight of what really matters, the facts." Yet he couldn't ignore the possibility that Helena might hold answers to questions no one else could resolve. The prosecution faced the challenge of weaving together a narrative that accounted for Helena's erratic claims while maintaining the focus on Jeffrey. "She's a red herring," one prosecutor said privately, "but she's dangerous because she muddies the waters." And that's exactly what the defense wants. By the time Helena was called to testify, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. She entered shakily, her hands trembling as she took the stand. Her testimony was as inconsistent as her previous statements, fragments of memory mixed with long pauses and denials. "I don't know if I was there," she said at one point, her voice barely audible. I might have been." The ambiguity of her words left the courtroom in stunned silence. Helena Stockley was ultimately dismissed as an unreliable witness, but her presence lingered over the trial like a ghost. Was she truly involved? Or was she just another casualty of a life ravaged by drugs and chaos? The truth remained elusive, but one thing was certain. Helena's shadow added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Jeffrey MacDonald commenced in 1979, nearly a decade after the brutal murders that had shocked Fort Bragg. Journalists packed the gallery, eager to capture every word, every glance, and every twist in a case that had captivated the nation. Jeffrey entered the courtroom looking composed, dressed in a sharp suit that belied the gravity of the charges against him. To his supporters, he appeared as a man wrongfully accused. To his critics, he was the very picture of cold calculation. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case, and the evidence they laid out was both detailed and damning. The forensic team meticulously reconstructed the crime scene, painting a chilling narrative that directly contradicted Jeffrey's account of the events. Central to their argument was the infamous pajama top. Prosecutors demonstrated how the garment's pattern of holes aligned perfectly with the stab wounds on Colette's body, suggesting that it had been placed over her before being stabbed repeatedly. This revelation sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. How could Jeffrey explain such a deliberate act if his story of a chaotic struggle were true? Blood spatter analysis became another cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Expert witnesses walked the jury through diagrams and photographs, showing how the distribution of blood contradicted Jeffrey's version of events. Kimberly's blood, found in the master bedroom in the hallway, indicated that she had been attacked there before being moved to her own bed. Kristen's blood, confined to her nursery, suggested she had been isolated during the attack. Jeffrey's blood, in contrast, was found almost exclusively in the living room, where he claimed to have been assaulted. The pattern painted a harrowing picture. There had been no chaotic intruders. Instead, the violence was contained, deliberate, and precise. The prosecution also called upon Colette's closest friends to testify about the state of her marriage. One friend recounted a conversation with Colette just weeks before her death. "She told me she was scared," the friend said, her voice breaking. "She said Jeffrey was under a lot of pressure and that their arguments were getting worse." The jury leaned in, their faces grim, as the implications of this testimony sank in. Could Colette's fears have foreshadowed her death? But the emotional peak of the prosecution's case came when Freddy Cassab took the stand. His transformation from Jeffrey's staunch defender to his most vocal critic was evident in every word he spoke. "I trusted him," Freddy began, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I thought he was the perfect husband for Colette, the perfect father for Kimberly and Kristen. But I was wrong." He paused, his gaze fixed on Jeffrey, who sat motionless at the defense table. "He didn't just take their lives. He destroyed everything they stood for, and I'll never forgive him for that." The courtroom fell silent as Freddy's words hung in the air, raw and unflinching. The defense, led by a team of high-powered attorneys, countered with a narrative centered on doubt. They highlighted Helena Stockley's confessions, portraying her as a credible suspect whose involvement had been overlooked. Helena's erratic behavior and drug use, while problematic, didn't negate the eerie similarities between her descriptions and the crime scene. "This is the woman Jeffrey saw," the lead defense attorney declared, holding up a photograph of Helena. "And yet she was never fully investigated. Why? Because the authorities were too focused on pinning this on Jeffrey." Helena herself was called to testify, but her presence only deepened the mystery. On the stand, she vacillated between vague admissions and outright denials. "I don't know," she mumbled repeatedly, her hands trembling. "Maybe I was there. Maybe I wasn't." The defense used her testimony to sow seeds of doubt, but to many in the courtroom, her unreliability only served to underscore the strength of the prosecution's case. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. "This was not the work of strangers," the lead prosecutor said, his voice firm. "This was the work of someone who knew this family intimately, someone who lived in that house, someone who could manipulate the scene to make it look like something it wasn't." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the jury. "The evidence doesn't lie, and neither should you." The defense, in their final appeal to the jury, emphasized the lack of direct evidence tying Jeffrey to the murders. "This case is built on theories," the defense attorney argued. "Theories and assumptions, and that's not enough to convict a man of such heinous crimes." When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Reporters whispered among themselves, speculating about the outcome. Freddy sat silently in the gallery, his hands clenched into fists. Jeffrey remained composed, but for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The trial had been a battlefield of evidence, emotion, and doubt, leaving everyone in its wake questioning what they believed. As the jurors filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable, the nation held its breath. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Jeffrey MacDonald sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. Across the room, Freddy Cassab leaned forward in his seat, his body tense. For over 6 weeks, the trial had laid bare every detail of the case, the evidence, the inconsistencies, the pain of a family shattered. Now, it all came down to this moment. The foreman rose, holding a folded piece of paper. The judge asked the question that everyone in the room had been waiting for. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The room seemed to hold its breath as the verdict was read. Guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder for the death of Kristen McDonald, and 2 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Colette and Kimberly. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Freddy Cassab closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he exhaled deeply. For him, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Across the aisle, Jeffrey sat stone-faced, his jaw tight. For the first time, his carefully maintained composure cracked. His eyes darted toward his defense team, then to the jurors, and finally to Freddy, who stared back at him with unflinching resolve. The judge turned to Jeffrey. "Dr. MacDonald, you have been found guilty of these heinous crimes. You will be sentenced to life in prison." The finality of the words echoed in the courtroom, leaving no room for doubt. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to capture the reactions of those involved. Freddy, flanked by his wife Mildred, spoke briefly but powerfully. "This isn't about revenge," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "This is about accountability. Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen deserved justice, and today, they finally got it." Not everyone agreed. Supporters of Jeffrey MacDonald gathered nearby, holding signs that read, "Free McDonald, an innocent man." To them, the verdict was a miscarriage of justice, a product of flawed evidence and public pressure. Jeffrey's defense attorney echoed their sentiment during a press conference. "This is not the end," he declared. "We will fight this conviction. Dr. MacDonald is an innocent man." In the days following the trial, public opinion remained sharply divided. Some saw Jeffrey as a cold-blooded killer who had fooled everyone for years. Others viewed him as a scapegoat, the victim of a botched investigation and an overzealous prosecution. The case became a lightning rod for debates about the criminal justice system, forensic science, and the power of public perception. Jeffrey, now confined to a federal prison, maintained his innocence. In letters to friends and supporters, he described himself as the victim of a conspiracy. "They wanted someone to blame," he wrote, "and I was an easy target." His legal team filed appeal after appeal, challenging the forensic evidence, the handling of the crime scene, and the exclusion of Helena Stockley's testimony. Each attempt was met with resistance from the courts, but Jeffrey refused to give up. For Freddy Cassab, the aftermath of the trial was both a relief and a burden. The years of fighting for justice had taken a toll on his health and his spirit. "I thought I'd feel better once it was over," he admitted to a reporter. "But there's no joy in this. I lost my family. Nothing can bring them back." Still, he remained steadfast in his belief that the truth had prevailed. "At least now Colette and the girls can rest in peace." The case continued to linger in the public consciousness, fueled by books, documentaries, and endless speculation. The release of new DNA evidence in the early 2000s reignited interest in the case. Jeffrey's legal team claimed that the results supported his story, but prosecutors argued otherwise. The courts ultimately rejected his appeals, affirming his conviction. Even decades later, the McDonald case remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of violence. For those who lived through it, Jeffrey, Freddy, and the investigators who pieced together the shattered fragments of that fateful night, it is a chapter of their lives that can never truly be closed. As Jeffrey sat alone in his cell, the weight of the verdict settled around him. Outside, the world continued to debate his guilt, but within those cold walls there was only silence, a silence that, for some, spoke louder than words. The years after Jeffrey MacDonald's conviction were filled with relentless appeals, unanswered questions, and the lingering shadows of doubt, For some, the trial had brought closure, a definitive end to a horrifying chapter. But for others, it left wounds that would never heal. Freddy Cassab's relentless pursuit of justice had taken its toll. Though the verdict validated his tireless efforts, it did not ease the pain of losing Colette and his grandchildren. Freddy carried the weight of their absence in every word he spoke, in every breath he took. "I gave everything to find the truth," he confided to a close friend. But what do you do when the truth doesn't bring peace? As he grew older, Freddy's health began to deteriorate, but his conviction in Jeffrey's guilt never wavered. Until his final days, he maintained a diary, a poignant record of his thoughts, his pain, and his enduring love for Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. In one entry, he wrote, "Justice is a cruel comfort. It doesn't bring them back, but it's all I could give them, and that has to be enough." Meanwhile, Jeffrey MacDonald remained steadfast in his claims of innocence. From his prison cell, he became the center of a movement championed by those who believed he had been wrongfully convicted. Books, television specials, and articles reignited debates, keeping his story alive in the public eye. MacDonald himself penned letters to anyone who would listen, maintaining that he was the victim of a flawed system. "I've been framed," he wrote in one letter. "The evidence was manipulated, the investigation botched. They wanted a scapegoat, and they found one in me." New developments occasionally surfaced, fueling speculation and reopening old wounds. The introduction of DNA testing in the 1990s brought a fresh wave of hope for Jeffrey's supporters. Hair fibers collected at the crime scene were analyzed, and while some results were inconclusive, none could definitively link Jeffrey to the murders. Jeffrey's defense team seized on this, filing appeals and demanding a retrial. "This is the proof we've been waiting for," his attorney proclaimed. But the courts remained unconvinced. The existing forensic evidence, coupled with the overwhelming circumstantial case, was enough to uphold his conviction. Forensic experts argued that the DNA findings didn't absolve Jeffrey, but instead highlighted the chaotic nature of the crime scene. "It doesn't change the core of the case," one prosecutor said in response to the appeals. "It doesn't explain the blood patterns, it doesn't explain the fibers, and it certainly doesn't explain the holes in his story." As the years passed, the case took on a life of its own. It became a cautionary tale about the complexity of justice, the limits of forensic science, and the human capacity for doubt. Each retelling added new layers to an already convoluted story, leaving the public to wrestle with an uncomfortable question. What if the system had failed? The shadow of Helena Stockley loomed large over the case even decades later. Despite her inability to provide a coherent account, her connection to the crime remained a tantalizing possibility. Some investigators admitted privately that they had lingering doubts about her role. "We'll never know the full truth," one retired officer said, "but I do know one thing. We didn't handle her right. She could have told us something we missed, or maybe she was just a distraction. Either way, it'll haunt me forever." For Jeffrey, the passing years brought isolation and reflection. His once charismatic demeanor began to fade as age and the weight of incarceration settled in. Still, his refusal to admit guilt remained unshaken. In an interview from prison decades after the murders, Jeffrey was asked if he felt remorse. His response was chilling. "What would I feel remorse for? I didn't kill them." And so the case of the McDonald murders remains unresolved in the hearts and minds of many. Was justice truly served, or was an innocent man condemned? The truth may never be fully known, but the impact of that fateful night in February 1970 continues to ripple outward, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of violence. As the lights dim on this chapter of history, one thing remains certain. The McDonald family tragedy is more than a story of crime. It's a story of grief, perseverance, and the unyielding pursuit of answers, even when the answers may never come.